Welcome back. You have almost made it. You've almost survived this course. You are now a well-trained neuroanatomist and neurochemist and neuroendocrinologist. You've got all the basic building blocks. You know how single neurons work. You know how bunches of them work. You know how they are thus able to regulate cells throughout your body, regulate hormonal events, and finally, you know how those hormones in turn get into your brain and regulate events there. We've been given the tools now to understand all of these features of our nervous system and our endocrine systems. We've been given the tools now to understand how things vary from one of us to the other, differences in amounts of messengers, differences in amounts of receptors, numbers of neurons, numbers of dendritic spines, connections, how the nets overlap, how long these messengers stick around for. We've got a first pass at the bewildering variability available to us, why we're all individuals, why we're all roughly the same in certain ways. We all have a cortex. We all have a hypothalamus. We all have a hippocampus. Why it is that there's none of us out there who have the exact same cortex that you have, and the exact same hormone secretory profiles, and the exact same ratios of one neurotransmitter to another. We begin to have a sense of the biological underpinnings of why we are absolutely unique, and why we're unique in ways that nevertheless show certain familiar patterns from one of us to the next. What this lets us to do now in this final lecture, what this brings us to, is an ability now to analyze some of the most integrative large pictures we will have had in this course, certain views of certain psychiatric disorders, certain personality disorders, where initially, 8 lectures ago, hearing about these, it would have seemed inconceivable, I would bet, to any of you to think this is a biological disorder. There is a gene, there is a neurotransmitter, there's a part of the brain, there's a hormonal imbalance which causes that person to act differently. What we'll see now as we hear about these disorders, and we hear that these are indeed turning out to have genetic roots and neurochemical roots and endocrine roots, that this begins to make some sense to us. We may not know the precise answer at this point, but it no longer surprises us that it can rest in this sort of reductive biology. And from there, it's a very small step to our final point to look at, which is there's just as much of a reductive biology, not explaining them and their diseases, but us and our quirks and our idiosyncrasies and the things that make us us. A first example, and this is one that I alluded to in the first moments of the first lecture, having to do with the workings of a certain part of the brain, an area that we've not really focused on so far in the course. But here's what you see. I guarantee every single day, no matter who you are, every single day you have some thought that's boastful or lustful or petulant or angry or this or that, where you would die if anybody knew you were thinking that. And there's a certain part of the brain which, if you get damaged there, every time you think one of those thoughts, you say it. You say it and you get disinhibited at that point. This is an area of the brain called the frontal cortex, and this does some really interesting stuff for us. And you get damage to the frontal cortex and you are now frontally disinhibited. And the sort of things the rest of us were trained real early in life to keep a lid on, you say it and you do it, and you are very socially inappropriate, and this is a neurological disease. The very first patient recognized as having this frontal disinhibition, this is a famous patient in neurology, a man named Phineas Gage, and he's back in all the textbooks. Phineas Gage was a railroad worker in the 1840s. You know, this sounds like some sort of one of those lines. Phineas Gage worked them railroads, and he was this very quiet, colorless man working them railroad lines. No incidences, came to work every day, quiet individual, all of that. One day there was an accident. One day there was an accident with some dynamite, and a long pole blew out Phineas Gage's forehead and went out the other side and took his frontal cortex with him. Amazingly, apparently, he was just knocked on his rear, got up, dusted himself off, said, you know, I think I have sort of a headache right now, was sent home minus his frontal cortex, and resumed life, perfectly clean surgical excision of that part of his brain, thanks to this dynamite. And what was most striking was, in the aftermath of this, complete transformation of his personality. This quiet, taciturn man became this loud, aggressive bully, this sexually disinhibited individual, getting into fights, brawling, drinking, all of that. I think it was 20 years into it, that a first physician examined him in a lot of detail and came up with this theory that this part of the brain, this frontal cortex, has something to do with these animal energies of ours, and in this very, very crude metaphorical way, this is the nearest thing we've got neuroanatomically to a superego. This is the part of the brain that teaches us you don't do that, you don't say that, maybe you think that, but you put a lid on it, the frontal cortex. Phineas Gage is the first case of this. A few years ago, a pair of neurologists sat down and did this very detailed study with Phineas Gage's skull, which is still on display in some anthropology museum somewhere, and with his skull, and they reconstructed the entry site and the exit site and did an MRI or some such thing, and they concluded that yes, indeed, it was his frontal cortex that was damaged, taken out there. Phineas Gage is the first example of this. And you see frontal patients in all sorts of other circumstances, individuals with car accidents, bullet wounds, head injuries of various sorts, individuals who have certain types of strokes, have this part of the brain damaged, and in the aftermath of frontal damage, you get disinhibited. The sort of stuff the rest of us would think but never ever say, these people can't control themselves. Interestingly, you see another version of this, and this is one that I alluded to right at the beginning of that lecture, people with Huntington's disease. Huntington's disease, a very rare neurological disease. Huntington's disease, also known as Huntington's chorea. Chorea, like choreography, movement of the body. In Huntington's chorea, you get uncontrolled movement of the limbs, which progresses to uncontrolled writhing of the whole body, horrible neurological disease, destroying a part of the brain having to do with motor control. Huntington's disease classically viewed as a disorder of movement. Huntington's disease, a genetic disorder which gets people around age 40 to 45 or so, hereditary disease. Something that has been known in the clinical lore for years with Huntington's patients is early on in their disease, in some cases, even before you see the motoric, the movement disorders, even before it's diagnosed as a disease, these people get behavioral changes. These people get a little bit frontally disinhibited. These people at age 40 get into a brawl out of nowhere, suddenly are discovered having an affair, become foul-mouthed, become very aggressive, saying inappropriate, hurtful things to people. The sort of scenario that I started off with in the first lecture, that 40-year-old guy living his quiet life in the suburbs, culminating in him embezzling the money from his workplace, skipping out on his family, disappearing, never being heard from again, until 2 years later when he shows up in a neurology ward with early-stage Huntington's disease. And what people are beginning to recognize is, early on, Huntington's disease is not just a neurological disorder of movement, it's a neuropsychiatric disorder as well of disinhibition. And in the last few years, remarkable observation looking at Huntington's patients early on in the disease, and they are, yes, indeed, getting damage in the part of the brain relevant to body movement, and that can be picked up on these brain imaging techniques. What they're also seeing is early on, there's damage to the frontal cortex as well. Now, this frontal business is so well understood that you get a bunch of neurobiologists together and they even use this term in an everyday sense. Here's how you would see this. You're at some scientific conference and some poor, quivering graduate student gets up and gives first presentation ever, nervous, just barely manages to make it through. The kid did okay. You feel great for the person. And then some totally insensitive jerk, big shot, gets up in the back row, savages the kid over some sort of minutia, chest thumping about his own accomplishments, attacking his enemies. Somebody at some point is going to lean over to somebody else and say, Jesus, he is getting more frontal all the time. And that may not just be a metaphor. That may not just be a way of using a term we all know that refers to a neurological disease. 8 lectures into this course, it should occur to us that when we look at people who differ in how much they speak their mind, who will sit there quietly waiting their turn versus who's pounding on the desk of the receptionist, who can speak in public versus who's too terrified to, inhibition, extroversion, things of those sorts, it doesn't take a lot of imagination on our part by now to think we may differ in numbers of neurons in the frontal cortex, how many projections they have, where they project to, the neurotransmitters involved. We can construct all sorts of scenarios where that jerk big shot in the back row has a frontal cortex that's not working as well as most people's. It begins to make some sense, not just for them when they've got the frontal cortex blown away after an accident, but the rest of us and our everyday differences. So a first example. A second example, the one that I also talked about in that very first lecture, we all go through this process of we're nervous about something, that application for the job, for the grant, whatever, that letter that really needs to get sent off, and we check the mailbox and we check it a second time and third time and we look underneath and look in the back and we just go through these little obsessive rituals. During a bad time, we find ourselves counting steps as we go up them and we can't stop ourselves. During anxious times, we've got that stupid jingle from some commercial in our head. 8 hours in one day, that stupid thing's going through there and you can't make it stop. We fall into these little obsessive patterns, these compulsions that we can't prevent. We do that during times of anxiety. We even do that at other times. We all have these little rituals. Let me show you a ritual that I've discovered, which is very common amongst our Americans in the latter part of the century. Here in this very technical schematic diagram, what I draw on the left here is, this is an aerial view, this is in fact a very high altitude photograph of a plate of Rice Krispie marshmallow treats. Kellogg's Rice Krispie marshmallow treats, and you will see this is the pattern of it, and you take your average American and give them a butter knife and leave them alone in that room for 15 minutes and you come back later and they will have done this. They will have trimmed off the extra piece. We all do that. We all do that. We can't stop ourselves. There's something that just bothers us about that piece sticking out there. I have questioned generations of my students at the university as to why they do this. Do they do this because, you know, they're trying to reduce the surface area so it remains fresher? No, not at all for that reason. Are they doing it because somehow if you just inadvertently cut off that extra sliver, it doesn't really count and you're not violating your diet? Not that reason either. We all have the same response. It just looks sort of irritating. You want to straighten out that edge, and that's more important than the eating of it. We just have this ritualistic need to straighten out the edge, to arrange the utensils, to make sure you've got your favorite pen before you start the exam. These little superstitious rituals. Most of the time, that's perfectly fine. Most of the time, that's not very bothersome. There's a subset of us out there for whom those traits are very bothersome. There's a subset of individuals whose lives are absolutely destroyed by it. These are not people who, God, I wish I could get that jingle out of my head. These are people who are incapacitated by these little ritualistic reflexes. And this is now termed obsessive-compulsive disorder. And it turns out there's an awful lot of folks out there. These are the people who I mentioned in the very first lecture who are spending 6-7 hours a day washing their hands, and they can't stop themselves. These are people who can't go in a doorway until they go through a complex ritual of opening and closing or touching the door jamb a certain number. These are people who can't go into the building where they're going for the job interview until they've walked a number of steps that's a multiple of a prime number or divisible by 9 or whatever little obsessive ritual they have, and they get to the door and it hasn't quite fit the number and they've got to go back to their car and do it again and again, and yet another job interview missed. People where they go out for a vacation and 5 miles away, they just know it, they left the gas on. No, you turned it off. The rest of the family's telling them, you turned it off, we checked, I left the gas on. Look, I'm not going to be able to enjoy this vacation anyway, I have to turn back and check. They turn around, come back, of course the gas wasn't left on, and leaving the house and saying, I think I forgot to lock the door. 50 miles into it, having to turn around, they are just stuck in these patterns. And these are ones that are mild irritants to us. These are ones that at worst may be actually quite irritating to us, where we can't concentrate on something we're reading, that sort of thing. It destroys the lives of these people. These itches, these patterns they simply can't suppress. Obsessive-compulsive disorder is viewed as an anxiety disease by psychiatrists. This is a disease where you're desperately just trying to impose patterns and rituals and structures to make a very frightening world less frightening. What's remarkable about this disease is it seems to run in families. There's a suggestion that there's a genetic component to it. There's a suggestion there's a neurochemical component. It's not worth going into those details, but physicians are beginning to try certain drugs that affect synapses in ways that we understand by now to try to control these symptoms. Fascinatingly, there are now some first studies using PET scanners, you know, those machines that will measure the amount of glucose, the amount of oxygen that your brain consumes. The first PET scanning studies on people with obsessive-compulsive disorder, and it turns out these people have elevated metabolism in parts of the brain having to do with motor movement. Their brains are working harder at all these little rituals. You can't start writing until you tap the pen 14 times or 28 times or some multiple of 7, and all these little movement rituals. You can't go into a doorway until you do that pattern. When you're washing, you have to do this arm 7 times and this arm 5 times, and all these little rules. They've got this metabolic itch and a certain motoric part of the brain that drives them to do this sort of stuff. You look at one of these individuals, and this is nothing subtle. These people are destroyed by this disease. This is not somebody who comes in and says, I don't know why it is, but I just can't stop myself from washing my hands. And I kid you not, these people will wash 6-7 hours a day. These rituals, carefully washing their hands with half a dozen different types of antiseptic soap that they've done research on at certain temperature of the water, 30 to 35 seconds with this soap on this hand, then this hand you let the water drip down this way, all of that. Finish the washing, and on the way out of the room, they tap their elbow against the door jamb. Who knows who's touched there, what sort of germs, and they go back, then they start all over again, and fired from yet another job, another relationship ruined, whatever, incapacitated by this, and they don't have much insight. It's not that they come in and say, you've got to help me, I can't stop washing myself. They come in and say, you've got to help me, I'm always dirty. They can't step away from their symptoms. And what is really interesting there is, again, all of us do this now and then. Not to that extent, but we have our anxious times where we fall into these little rituals. We have our lucky pens. We've got our, our fortunate superstition-laden outfits that we wear on certain occasions. These are not big deals. These are minor versions of them. It's a little bit of a big deal when you do indeed not be able to concentrate on something because you've got this jingle running through your head. We're all wrestling with these little obsessive and compulsive traits during times of anxiety. Whatever the biology is going to be of them and their incapacitation, it's going to be very similar yet writ small for us in these little versions we have. This is something that gets all of us to differing degrees. Another example of this, and this is a fascinating one as well. When you study schizophrenia, you see some of the really dramatic symptoms of this disorder. Schizophrenia is, above all else, a disease of thought, a disease of disordered thought. These are people who have loose associations, hallucinations, inappropriate levels of abstraction. They hear voices, they have paranoid tendencies. Often, you can tell after a paragraph talking to someone who's schizophrenic that there is something very, very wrong with their thought processes. In addition, schizophrenia is also a disease of inappropriate emotions, inappropriate socialization. These are people who are often very socially isolated. These are people believing that they are hearing voices instructing them to do things. This whole picture we're familiar with. In the last few decades, another disease has been sorted out which has some similarities to schizophrenia, but most broadly you'd have to think of it as being a milder version. And this is called schizotypal personality disorder. In schizotypal personality disorder, it's not that you find someone who's totally disconnected from the rest of the world, the way schizophrenics often are. These are people who are a little bit reclusive. They prefer to stay by themselves. They often have very private occupations. This is the person who's the film projectionist, alone in the movie house working from 8 in the evening until midnight each night. This is the person who's the fire tower watcher. This is the person who has some sort of fairly isolated occupation. These are individuals who are somewhat disconnected from the world. In other ways, they tend to have rather flat emotions, flat affect. The most interesting thing about them, though, is a trait that's called metamagical thinking. These are not people who are thought disordered, who can't go 2 paragraphs without jumbling off into some incoherent sort of tangent, and it's not of that sort. It's much milder. This is someone who has a very intense interest in science fiction and fantasy. This is someone with a very intense focusing on some new age nonsense, some telekinesis, sort of transporting themselves over space and time sort of thing. This is someone, and here's where things begin to get folks very uncomfortable. Another trait of the metamagical thinking is these are often people with a very literal interpretation of the Bible. That the world really was created in 7 days, that it is possible to walk on water. These are some of the traits that pop up. Not full-blown psychotic behavior. Instead, this tendency for believing in fantasy. These are people who really will argue with you about how Elvis was kidnapped on UFOs and he's now living in some, he's living with Salman Rushdie holding up in some apartment somewhere, that sort of thing. They don't believe in total crazy stuff, just a little bit odd beliefs. And this is not craziness. You have perfectly responsible adults who can go to Star Trek conventions. You can have, the president's wife consult astrologers and still be taken seriously in the fashion pages. You've got all sorts of things like that. These are not mental illnesses. These are just sort of odd, quirky individuals with these traits. This is the interesting thing. Who are the schizotypals? Who are the schizotypals when you look at our population? These are relatives of the schizophrenics, very frequently. Schizotypal personality disorder was first defined amongst family members of schizophrenics. And you begin to see a genetic continuum. Schizophrenia is a genetic disorder. And schizotypalism appears to have a genetic component as well, and they're related. Get a full-blown version of whatever this genetic trait is, and you have something we call schizophrenia. Get a partial version of it, and it looks as if you have something that more resembles schizotypal. And remember, this is not a mental illness. All of us at times are likely to consider seeing a science fiction movie, or we'll glance at a horoscope and maybe think about it for a half second, and these people think about it for a few hours a day. There's a continuum, and you'd be awfully hard-pressed to say this stops being normal, and this is where you now are officially a schizotypal, and get to the other end of it, and now you are a card-carrying schizophrenic. This is a continuum, and this is a genetic continuum as well, very striking. What's particularly interesting in the case of schizotypals is there's a marvelous old literature in anthropology stretching back 50, 60 years speculating about schizotypals. Who are the schizotypals? And I don't mean a schizotypal sitting there in the film projection room sort of mulling over Elvis and that sort of thing, but schizotypals throughout most of human history, and a number of anthropologists have speculated these are the shamans. These are the witch doctors, these are the medicine men and the medicine women, people who are not full-blown disoriented in their thinking. These are not people who are babbling in tongues while, you're in the middle of a silent hunt. They're doing it during ritual times. These are people who are not hearing voices all the time. They're hearing voices during times of tribal troubles where they need to get advice from the gods, things of that sort. Controlled metamagical thinking. Some very, very convincing speculations over the years that throughout human history, schizotypalism was probably associated with a certain type of shaman. Speculative but fascinating to me for our purposes. The main point is these folks have some traits in common with everybody else. It seems to be a continuum. A next version of this, another version of this sort of puzzlement. And in this one, people really get disturbed by one facet of this. Epilepsy. Epilepsy, uncontrolled seizures in your brain. Uncontrolled rhythmic release of action potentials, a number of different ways technically to describe what a seizure is. Seizures can be initiated, can be triggered in different parts of the brain. As we heard already, H.M. had his epileptic seizures in the hippocampus. We heard about those very rare cases of amygdaloid seizures where there was the violence beforehand. Often with an epileptic seizure, 5 seconds, 30 seconds before the seizure, someone will get an altered sense of things going on, an aura. Someone may get a hallucination. In the case of that amygdaloid seizures, someone may suddenly lash out. There are often behavioral changes right before a seizure. And that's often rather informative as to where the seizure is initiating, where the epileptic focus is, the initiation spot in the brain. It turns out not only does that occur, but in certain types of epilepsy, the person's personality changes as well. And I don't just mean in the 30 seconds before the seizure, but all the rest of the time, independent of how often they get a seizure. You would immediately speculate, well, you get a serious disease, and that will have an impact on your personality. In this one type of epilepsy, there's a consistent packet of traits that pop up, and this is called a subtype of temporal lobe epilepsy. And you get temporal lobe personality. Again, a fascinating collection of traits. These are ones that I referred to in the very first lecture as well, and one symptom there really disturbs a lot of folks. Temporal lobe personality. First characteristic of it is people become extremely humorless, very, very serious. People who had very sort of buoyant, humorous personalities, they change with the onset of the temporal lobe epilepsy, and you don't necessarily see that change with other epilepsies. It's not the epilepsy in and of itself, it's having this part of the brain. Temporal lobe, which includes your limbic system. So you get this loss of humor, this seriousness. In addition, temporal lobe epileptics and temporal lobe personality individuals tend to show this trait called neophobia. They don't like new things. They walk to work the same way each day. They tend to wear the same type of clothes all the time. They just have a couple of friends who they stay with. A wonderful neuropsychological term. They're described as having a viscous personality, a sticky personality. They just have a couple of friends they hold on to closely. They go into a restaurant and they always order the same type of food in there. They perseverate on certain things. Another trait they show, this is one of the odder ones, they become hypergraphic. Hypergraphic meaning they write obsessively all the time. They write long tracts about all sorts of serious issues. They come to meet a new doctor and say, well, if you're going to get a sense of who I am as an individual and as a patient, here I have a 40-page document here I've written for you, my view on the role of humans in evolution, and a week later for the follow-up appointment, bringing the 20-page addendum. They show this trait of writing, hypergraphia. The final trait is the one that has puzzled people the most, and one that represents our first really, really disturbing fact in here, as opposed to the moderately disturbing ones I've brought up already. Temporal lobe personality individuals, once they have the onset of their epilepsy, become much more interested in religious issues. They take a very strong interest in religion and philosophical issues. They don't necessarily become religious. They may become very philosophically caught up with the subject. Wonderful story about this that I heard about Norman Geschwin. Norman Geschwin is one of the towering figures in neurology. In the century, Harvard neurologist who died at a very early age a few years ago. Geschwin was the person who first defined these temporal lobe personality traits, and he was very taken with this religious aspect. And apparently, one day, he had a bunch of his residents reporting to him, and one of them had just seen some new patient who had come in, some adolescent, with temporal lobe epilepsy, and was going through some of the seizure symptoms and the medications and going through the whole case report. And at the end, clearly this resident, I think, probably wanting to tweak the great man a little bit there, saying, and, you know, actually, this kid doesn't really fit your personality profile. I mean, he's got some of these other traits. He does seem to write a lot. He's a pretty serious kid, but the religion stuff doesn't hold up there. And Geschwin said, what do you mean by that? And he said, well, I asked him, is he religious? And he said, no, I'm not at all religious. So there you go, it doesn't fit. Geschwin said, you did that all wrong, out of my way, and goes marching down the hall and bringing his band of residents behind him, march into this kid's room, and Geschwin introduces himself and says, tell me, are you a religious young man? And he says, no, I'm not. And Geschwin then shows the critical follow-up question. He says, why aren't you? And the kid proceeds to give this impassioned hour-long lecture about Martin Buber's problems with God's treatment of Job and Bertrand Russell's Why I'm Not a Christian and, you know, inconsistencies in the Epic of Gilgamesh. Hours of this, they had to shut the kid up after a while. And, you know, Geschwin turning around and, you know, closing his case there with the resident, you see these traits. You see these traits in these individuals, and this is extraordinary stuff. How can this be going on? You have a seizure in one part of the brain once a year, and it does nothing to your personality. You have a seizure in another part of the brain once a year. It's not that these are uncontrolled epileptics. These are people typically with their seizures under control with various medications. A seizure in this temporal lobe region once a year, and suddenly you find God to be a far more interesting subject than you did before, and you want to write about it at great length. This is very disturbing stuff. This is very disturbing stuff in terms of the implications. Before we look at the implications, what should be clear by now is the biology underlying this stuff should not seem all that far-fetched by now. In all these cases, we begin to have the tools, maybe not to answer the question of why do these behavioral traits occur, but we can begin to make some guesses. They'll probably turn out to be the wrong guesses because these things are always more complicated than one would guess beforehand, but it begins to seem plausible. Increased metabolism and motor pathways, and suddenly you have this obsessive compulsive need to arrange the silverware perfectly symmetrically before you can sit down to dinner. a moderate genetic disorder in certain pathways and you're more subject to certain superstitious behaviors. Take out the frontal cortex and you've just cut the brake on some sort of inhibitory pathway. Have a few less neurons in there and the brake doesn't work quite as well. We begin to see ways in which they may be describing a biology of all sorts of interesting individual differences. And this begins to strike real close to home for lots of folks in lots of very challenging sorts of ways. When we look at these, what we're eventually getting to is this extraordinary biology. We are getting more and more ways to give labels to what we are and to who we are. What is very interesting about these diseases is they didn't exist for the most part 50 years ago. There were no ways to describe these disorders. These are mostly new diagnoses, and there's new ones all the time. This is just scratching the surface of some of these subtle neuropsychiatric disorders. We didn't used to have names to even conceptualize the way people's lives were being destroyed by these disorders. And we are getting the names, and we will get more of them, and we are understanding more and more, spreading this umbrella of explanation over all sorts of quirks in there. And eventually, we are going to get to a point where we are going to understand the biology of why some of us vote Republican and some Democratic, why some of us like spicy foods, why some of us can have stable relationships and others not, and we will be able to say something about these in a very powerful biological way. What's going to happen when we've got enough of those names that all of us get 3 or 4 of those diagnoses? What's going to happen when we've all got a couple of those traits? If you want to be cynical, there's some very frightening things coming down the line there. If you want to be cynical, one outcome of that is God help you if you get one of those labels, one of those neuropsychiatric labels on your forehead. God help you if that happens to you and you happen not to be very well off financially or not very well connected, that sort of thing, because we know plenty of precedent where that's going to mean you may have trouble getting health insurance. You may have trouble having a job, that sort of thing. If people know, oh, that person has this disease, that person has this problem. As long as it's labeled as a disease, God help you if you're in that category. To be even more cynical, if you get one of those labels and you are well connected or well off, maybe God help all the people around you, because forever after, you've got an excuse when you do something that's really unpleasant for everybody else. It's not me, it's my disease. That's the cynical end. There's a possibility that something much more hopeful will come out of it, and it's embedded in that same sentence. It's not me, it's my disease, it's not him, it's his disorder. We do something extraordinary in this century. 500 years ago, people with epilepsy were burned at the stake in many European communities. They were possessed. They had some sort of satanic problem, things of that sort. Obviously, no one with epilepsy is burned at the stake anymore. At times in the past, epileptics were prosecuted for assault and battery if in the process of a seizure flailing about they struck somebody. No one would dream of doing that to an epileptic these days. We've been taught this enormously modern, enormously defining statement of us in this century, and the compassion we've learned during this. Most of us have been trained to say, yes, indeed, it's not him, it's his disease. We've been trained to draw a boundary between who a person is, the essence of that individual, and the biological tumult that happens to be distorting who that individual is. We're real good at drawing that boundary when it comes to epilepsy. We're not so good at drawing that boundary when it comes to schizophrenia, for example. The difference between the essence of who John Hinckley is and the biological disorder that made him shoot at Reagan back when. Hinckley is a diagnosed schizophrenic, and when he was hospitalized after his trial instead of being in prison, there were editorials all over the country bellowing about how he was getting away with it. And those individuals had not been trained very well to look at that man and say, that's not him, that's the biology that's distorting him. And a whole lot of us are even less effective at doing that when looking at issues of who's the essence of this child and where's the dyslexia or the learning disabilities that are impinging upon them. We are having to draw this line between who we are and a biological disorder in all sorts of unlikely areas we never anticipated, and we're not very good at that in some of these cases now. We're going to have to get better at that, and we're going to have to get better in terms of understanding not just them and their diseases, but us and the things that are close to home. Because what you begin to realize after a while is, in a sense, there but for the grace of God go I, and if you recognize kinship in neurochemistry, it's not all that crazy to begin to think that a full-blown version of one of these disorders, and you were schizophrenic and thinking that you were the Empress of Virginia, and in a moderate version of it, you were schizotypal and simply are really into science fiction and fantasy, and an even milder version, you're stuck on a bank line and you can spend 30 seconds having a pleasing fantasy based on some movie you saw the other day. And there's a biological continuum amongst these traits, and this begins to describe all of us. We've seen a fascinating version of that in the last 5 years or so. New biological information about something that didn't used to be considered biological about most individuals, and one that's really challenging our sense of who we are and what we do with that information. And this was this extraordinary discovery a number of years ago by a man named Simon LeVay, a neuroscientist, then at the Salk Institute in California, who found a structural difference in the brains of human men depending on whether they were gay or straight. And this study wound up on the cover of Time magazine, tremendous attention, finding a brain basis of sexual orientation. What LeVay did was look at one area of the brain. What sort of area is interesting? You guessed it, a sub-area of the hypothalamus that people had known for years in rodents. Females and males had different sizes. Males had a bigger version of this part of the hypothalamus than females did. People found the same thing in the human brains. On the average, males had this section larger than females. And what LeVay did was look at brains of gay and straight men post-mortem, and what he saw was the brains of gay men had the pattern more like that of human females. They were half the size as that of straight men. This was enormous in its impact, covered everywhere. People were shocked by this amazing finding. It remains to be seen just how solid this is. LeVay is a superb scientist, but these were very difficult studies. They've not yet been replicated by a whole lot of other people. There were some reasons why these studies may have been complicated. Let's assume for the moment that this is indeed the case, that this is a consistent difference in the brain depending on your sexual orientation. Let's even assume one version of this correlation that people really find to be most interesting, that this is a cause of the sexual orientation rather than an outcome of it. Let's assume that. What are we going to do societally with that information? What are we going to do with a 12-year-old where a few years down the line we are going to have the brain imaging techniques to look at somebody's brain at that age and tell them what kind of hypothalamus they have? Do we want that going on? What are we going to do when somebody who is perfectly happy and healthy and well-adjusted with whatever sexual orientation choices they have made, and oh no, it turns out they've got the wrong kind. They are gay and they have a straight hypothalamus, or they're straight and it turns out they have a gay hypothalamus. What do you do when that happens? What are we going to do with the various people flogging their cures in the National Enquirer to change that size of your part of the brain? As you know, somebody's going to be making a fortune doing. What are we going to do with this information? Unfortunately, the history of biology, the history of neurobiology and behavior in general, has been filled with all sorts of people who've made this mistake that just because you can describe something, you begin to think about manipulating something, and when you begin to think of manipulate, you decide what you're now doing is curing, and you start trying to cure things that ain't broken, and before you know it, we've got a version 50 years ago, a bunch of folks marching around in brown shirts deciding a normal human behavior involves having blonde hair and Aryan features. And we're in that danger. We're in that danger every time we find new information about this stuff. There are tremendous dangers there, and we are going to have to be vigilant about this. Amid those dangers, though, I think there's tremendous room for some optimism, because if you study these issues in an open-minded way, the only conclusion you can reach is one that we've got to be more open-minded. More open-minded as to what constitutes normality, more open-minded as to who our brethren are in terms of biology and neurochemistry and anatomy, and constantly being reminded that with a little bit more of this and a little bit less of that in your brain, you'd have one of those labels as well, and what you get there is an imperative to be more tolerant and more protective and more understanding of them and their diseases and us and our quirks. I think that's the policy outcome when you study this sort of issue and really think about it. The other way in which people find this to be disturbing is not on the policy level, how many dollars do we give for this sort of educational program, what do we do with this sort of neurological disease, but the philosophical implications of this. And this is where people really get disturbed. A lot of people who study the subject find this to be very challenging, very distressing in a certain sort of way. Many of us, probably most of us, have a certain pretension that we take a great deal of comfort in, which is we're individuals. We're individuals, we are these shimmering mysteries of uniqueness, we are this flickering flame that nobody else can catch and describe. We are unlike anyone who has ever walked the planet before. We are ourselves, and we take tremendous pleasure and comfort in that. What if these scientists inadvertently go and explain everything? What if they inadvertently take us in our shimmering mystery and reduce us into a bunch of equations and reduce us into a bunch of formulas and chemical pathways and these mechanistic sort of things, and look at what that will rob us of? People are very disturbed by this. People are very disturbed if there's a suggestion that there's one person out there on this planet whose degree of religious belief or degree of religious lack of belief might have something to do with their brain chemistry. Any of these variants, people get very disturbed at this point. And this disturbance is sort of captured very nicely, a classic science fiction story written a number of decades ago. I believe the name was The 10 Billion Names of God. And what the story was about was a number of scientists focusing on the fact that in classical Tibetan religion, there's 10 billion different names for God, and these scientists decided to sit down and program a computer to start spitting out all these names, all the different names of God, spitting out all these names. And what happened in the story was, as each name was spit out by the computer, one of the stars in the sky was extinguished. And this is a metaphor lots of people have for the bad, sterile, demystifying version of what science does. We are these shimmering mysteries, and science is just going to go ruin everything by explaining it, and all the stars in the heavens are going to be extinguished. And eventually we're going to know more and more about less and less, and we will lose our souls in the process. That's the worry that many people have if this area of science keeps going and eventually turns us into bunches of equations. My sense is you don't actually have to worry about this. You don't have to worry about this for a number of different reasons. The first one being, so what if science goes and explains everything? Birds make perfect sense in terms of aerodynamics. Aerodynamic engineers can sit there and analyze bones of birds and the weight of them and the angles of the feathers, and birds make total sense, and their ability to fly can be reduced to wondrously clear-cut equations, and that doesn't stop us for a moment of standing there and looking at some bird flying over and being amazed by them. Bach can be reduced to a bunch of contrapuntal rules about how he constructed his fugues and things of that sort, and that doesn't stop us from being moved to tears by it just because there is an explanation that doesn't rob the mystery of it. And I am a scientist, and unlike many people who do science, I see no reason why you have to choose between science and emotion. It is perfectly possible to be intensely moved by these things with, at the same time, the understanding that there's a biological underpinning. So there's this sense that even if those scientists screw up and they go and inadvertently explain everything, we're not in trouble. That should not take away that sense of mystery. The other reason why we don't have to be worried about that is the scientists are never going to go and explain everything. They're never going to get to that point. What should be perfectly obvious 8 lectures into this, just scratching the surface of the subject, is as soon as we think we're explaining something, we may very well do that, and we bring up 20 more questions in the process, and those 20 questions are much better than the original one we went after. A wondrous quote by a man named J.B.S. Haldane, one of the great geneticists of the century, very interesting man who had all sorts of outside activities as well. And Haldane had this wonderful quote explaining this, which is, life is not only stranger than we imagine, life is stranger than we can imagine. And it's for this reason that the scientists are never going to inadvertently go and explain everything and rob us of our mystery and turn us into equations. That won't happen. And the best place to finish this whole set of lectures is to emphasize that point, saying the purpose of science is not to rob us of mystery. The purpose of science is not to cure us of mystery. The purpose of science is to constantly reinvent that sense and constantly to reinvigorate it. That's science at its best.